So we're doing this series that we started last week called The Way, where we're going through the Gospel of John leading up to Easter. Last week we looked at John 1. This week I'm going to be looking at John 2, so I'm going to be preaching out of John 2, 13 to 22. Last week we asked the question, will you let God shine in your darkness? And today we're going to be looking at the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When, therefore, he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you that I can be up here, that I have this opportunity to share a word from your scriptures. Please give me wisdom as I attempt to share this message today, and please give those here discerning ears to hear what it is that you have to say, whether or not my words live up to that. So, in your name, amen. So we read through this story, but I want to set the context for us a little bit. So Jesus was at the temple during Passover. So this is a diagram of the temple. And where there were money changers and people selling animals there, and they would have been set up in this outer part here. This is called the Court of the Gentiles. That's where anybody could go. It was where everyone had access to the Jewish God. So they would go in and people would change money in there. So this is the part of the temple that Jesus was in. And the reason that there were these tables set up is because it was Passover. Now, Passover happened once a year, and so these tables would only be set up for 3 or 4 weeks out of the year, because what people would do is if you were Jewish, you would come every year if you were close enough, and you would come bring a sacrifice and an offering to the temple. So people would come from far away because the Jewish people were spread out all throughout the world at this point. So if you were really, really far away, you might only come once in your life. You might only come a couple times. But it was a pilgrimage that would be made each year. And a lot of times, these people had big families. If you read any of the genealogies in the Bible, they list 1 billion sons, like, for every person who's in there. So I assume they all had big families. And honestly, I'm not sure how they made it, because I grew up in a largish family. There were 7 people in my family. 2 brothers, 2 sisters, my parents, and me. And our yearly pilgrimage, our longest one that we would make, is we would go visit my grandparents, who lived in Pennsylvania. We lived in Ohio, and it was about a 10-hour drive, or 8.5, if they weren't taking radar very much. Still a long drive, though. And those of you who have driven places with numerous kids or siblings before know that those car rides are what sibling fights are made of. And with my family, it was the worst because there were 7 of us. We were in a minivan. So it's not like you could physically separate people. You were literally squished up next to the person next to you. There would inevitably be fights over who gets to go where. Where's the line in the seat that you can't come across? Treaties would be made. You can borrow my Game Boy if I get this much extra line space. Those treaties would inevitably be broken. Swift retribution would follow in the form of a fist to the face. So it was lots of fun. It was a barrel of monkeys. So I sympathized with these families that would come from far away because, my family doing just our 10-hour trip we would have all these fights, and we had all these modern comforts. We were in a vehicle that could go way faster than we could walk or ride on a donkey or whatever. It was climate controlled. We had heat and air conditioning. We had a stereo. We listened to cassette tapes. And yeah, I'm old enough that I listened to cassette tapes. So I know what those are. That really impressed the first crowd. They're like, "Whoa, he knows cassette tapes." So we had all these comforts and this ease, and these families that would come to Passover each year, they didn't have these. They would have to walk or ride on animals, and they'd be out in the elements, and some of them it would take them days. And so considering how much, how traumatic these trips were for my family, I can't imagine what it was like for them. And so on top of just bringing your family with you, they were also required to bring a sacrifice and an offering at the temple. And at the temple, the offering that you were supposed to bring was supposed to be pure silver. And since these people were spread out all throughout the world, they would have different currencies and they wouldn't have the right stuff. So money changers would have their table set up around Passover at the temple so they could change money out, and they would sell animals there, taking advantage of this temporary high demand that was there. So that's why there's money changers and people selling animals in the temple. And I want to look at one of the reasons that this story stands out. So I'm going to talk about two reasons the story stands out. This is the first one, is that we see Jesus make a surprisingly violent move. We see this pattern in the Gospels that Jesus is not someone who responds with violence, though his disciples are quite the opposite. They try to find every opportunity to start a fight. At one point, Jesus sends his disciples to this town, and they don't listen to them. So they ask Jesus, can we call down fire from heaven on this town, because they wouldn't listen to us? Jesus had to explain to them, we don't burn people. That's not how we do things. When Jesus is getting arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter pulls out his sword to defend Jesus, and Jesus says, no, we don't live by the sword. Jesus has compassion on people and encourages those who strive to be like him to turn the other cheek, even when it's not in their self-interest. But here, we seemingly see Jesus contradicting this. Jesus' apparent upheaval of this philosophy is striking, and it begs the question, what's so important here that Jesus is literally getting up in arms? And he sits down and makes a whip of cords. So what I love about John's version of this interaction is that it says that Jesus made a whip of cords. Like, he didn't bring one expecting to do this, but he sat down and made one. And I have to imagine that would have been funny to watch the disciples watch Jesus make this whip of cords, understanding his MO for peaceful resolutions to things. Is he making a... No, he's like making a belt or something. Jesus, that kind of looks like a whip. If it is, that's no judgment, but like, we could get some baseball bats. Like, what are we going up against here? We're ready to scrap. So it seems like Jesus is getting ready to get violent here. And when I was doing research on this story here, one of the things that I came across is a translation issue that happens in some versions of the Bible. So in verse 15 there it says, and making a whip of this is in the ESV here. He says, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And I love the ESV. I use it all the time. But this is the one example that I'll admit where it's not the best translation, because it says with the sheep and oxen, which makes it sound like Jesus drives out the people and also their sheep and oxen. But a better translation of this verse says, he drove them all out of the temple, both the sheep and oxen, not with. So in some versions of the Bible it says with, which makes it sound like Jesus is driving out the people and the sheep and cattle. But the true understanding of this is that Jesus didn't whip people, as far as John tells us. He only drives out the sheep and cattle. That being said, Jesus isn't totally peaceful here. He overturns tables, scatters the money, and rebukes them. Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. His disciples remember that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. And what they're referencing here, what they remember is a verse from Psalms, where King David he's calling out to God because he felt alone in his profound commitment to the temple. David wanted to build the temple for God, and God told him, no, you're not going to do it. Your son is going to do it. And David feels like no one else has this commitment to the temple except for him. And the disciples recognize that Jesus has the same zeal. Now, zeal is not a word that we use a whole lot, so I'm going to go ahead and define it for us a little bit. Usually my go-to for zeal means an eagerness or ardent interest in pursuit of something. And whenever I think of the word zeal, I think of this clip that I'm going to show here of this comedian talking about when he loves using the term my wife. And just the way that he describes this term is, for me, I consider it to be the embodiment of the word zeal.
I love saying my wife. It sounds so adult. That's my wife. It's great. You sound like a person. I said it even before we were married. We were just dating, and we were once getting on an airplane, and Anna's ticket didn't say anything, and my ticket said priority access. It doesn't matter why. But we were getting on, and I said, can my wife board with me? And they were like, yes, of course, right this way. And I was like, oh, that is so much better than all those times I was like, can my girlfriend come? And yeah, I shouldn't have said it that way, but still. My wife just has some kick to it, you know? Get away from my wife. No one talk to my wife. Marriage is gonna be very magical. I didn't kill my wife. That's like, ooh, who's that fella? I bet he did kill his wife.
So except for that last way that he uses the term my wife, the way he uses it is like this jealous ownership. It's, don't talk to my wife. We often associate jealousy as we think of it as a negative trait, but in the right context, when it's being zealous, it's about fierce protection of something that you have a claim or ownership to. So in Jesus' case, his zeal is for. In Jesus' case, it was a burning jealousy for the temple, his Father's house. His zeal is for pure worship. Oh, look, there's the definition. Oh, look, I just said that. So next, so this is what Jesus is passionate about. He's passionate for pure worship, that his Father's house be used the right way. So the next thing that I want to address is that I'm not sure that we always have a right understanding of what the temple was. Because a lot of times we think, oh, the temple, it was like their big church that they had. But the temple's a lot more than that. Temple is not the same as church. The Jewish people had an equivalent to the church, and it's what our modern churches are based on, which is the synagogue. So they would have these in different cities, and it's a place you would come to gather, pray, and teach, which is what we do here at Crossroads. But the temple was more than that. Broken down to its most fundamental form, the temple was the dwelling place of God. And this is a view that was held by other religious groups at the time too, that in the pagan religions during the Old Testament, they viewed their temple as a house their deity physically inhabited. That if their temple got ransacked and taken over, that their God would literally be kicked out of their house, that their God was physically there. And this is the same way that it was viewed within Judaism, that God physically was there. There's a lot of times throughout the Bible, some people would claim that the whole Bible is a story of the temple, of the changing dwelling place of God. But the first place that we see the temple is in the Garden of Eden. The author of Genesis uses temple language to describe the garden. It's very intentionally done, and the people who would have read this account of the garden in the time it was written would have read this and said, oh, he's comparing this to the temple. So here's some of the ways that the garden is like the temple. It's where God was physically present with his people. He would walk with them in the garden. He would walk with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are charged with working the garden and taking care of it, similar to how priests in the later temples were charged with caring for the temple. Gold and precious stones were in the garden, the same materials that are described as being what the sacred items in the temple were constructed of. When Adam and Eve are removed from the garden, cherubim are set to guard it. And cherubim weren't the chubby babies the way we picture them today. That's not very intimidating for guarding anything. They were, back in the day, they would have been thought of as these non-human, angelic creatures with multiple sets of wings and all these different animal features, and sometimes human ones also, but that their prominent way that they were portrayed was as guardians of the temple and the tabernacle. And so we see this in the tabernacle later on, and then in Solomon's temple. So the Garden of Eden was humanity's touch point to God. That's where he physically came to be with his people. After getting kicked out of the garden, we don't see this physical presence of God with his people until the tabernacle. Tabernacle. I even put it in the slide this time. So the tabernacle, the word tabernacle literally means tent. And so when the Israelites were leaving Egypt after captivity and they were heading for the Promised Land, they didn't have a house for God to live in, so they made a tent. So as they moved on their way along, they could bring God with them. So if the temple is God's house, the tabernacle was an RV till they got to the real house. When God enters the tabernacle, everyone can physically see his presence descend on it. In Exodus 40, it talks about how when Moses dedicates the temple, that a cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and at night the tabernacle would be lit up as if there was a fire inside it, and during the day a cloud would be on it, that people could see God lives here. Once we see the Israelites reclaim the promised land, Solomon, David's son, builds the first permanent temple. Its construction takes years and years, an astounding amount of resources, and it's a marvel. And people come from faraway lands to visit Solomon and to see this temple that he's built. And when it's completed at the dedication, God sends fire down from heaven, and his glory fills the temple. And once again, the people see God physically is here. Later on in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel sees a vision where God shows him the idolatrous worship being performed in the temple. In this most holy place that's supposed to be the one touch point that God has with humanity, his people are blatantly worshiping idols in this place that was supposed to be just for him and his people. And so we see God leave the temple. He makes a show of it. He slowly departs, moving from the Holy of Holies outward until he's in the outer court, and then he leaves out the east gate. This happens because the people had corrupted their worship. They were in the temple, God's presence, and in his presence began worshiping others. Eventually, this temple is destroyed, and the Israelites are taken captive. And this is the time in which they're spread out all throughout the world. Once they return from captivity, the second temple is built. And it's not quite as magnificent as Solomon's temple, but it's still a good temple, but we don't see God come back into it. Every other time we've been able to physically see God's presence in the temple, but not the second temple. Later, after the Romans take over, the temple needs to be refurbished, so Herod the Great launches a renovation program. There were lots of issues with the temple. The blinds were falling down. The floor in the back needed to be replaced, and they had to put an electric sign. So they did. That took Joe a minute to laugh there. So they did their own renew, relate, reach out. But unlike Crossroads, hopefully, this renovation took 46 years up until Jesus was at the temple, and then they weren't really finished for another 33 years. So they spent almost 80 years doing their renovation of the temple. And this is done by Herod the Great, who's not a Jew, and so he isn't allowed in past the court of Gentiles like we talked about at the beginning. But he finishes it, and it's a fine temple. But again, we don't see God enter it. Not until Jesus comes to the temple. John, throughout his gospel, intentionally uses temple language to refer to Jesus. There's Herod's temple. Joe shared this verse last week in John 1:14. It says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And that word dwell among us is the same word that's used for the tabernacle. It literally means to set up tent, to make yourself at home. The Message version of this is the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Previously, God had only been with people in the temple, but now with Jesus, he was actually in the neighborhood. He was with the people outside of the temple. In this story, John spells that out for us, that he says Jesus was talking about the temple of his body. Oops, that was too soon. In Matthew 1:23, they're told to name Jesus Emmanuel, which literally means God with us, which is what the temple is about. After God's departure from Solomon's temple, God had been physically absent from his people, and with Jesus we see the solution to that. Jesus comes to the temple, which is supposed to be the people's place to be with God, and sees that they're not there for worship, but to make money. So Jesus' cleansing of the temple was a declaration of war on hypocritical religious leaders. Jesus' zeal was for God's purposes, but he didn't find that zeal when he came to the temple. And then we see the response to him cleansing the temple. And this is the second thing that's interesting about the story, and that's the religious leaders' response. So Jesus comes into the temple and starts raining havoc, sending animals everywhere, throwing people's money around in tables. And instead of calling the Roman guards on him, which they could have done, they were in the court of Gentiles, so they could have had the Romans come in and take him out. They ask him, what sign do you show for these things? What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Essentially, they're saying, who said you could do this? Like, instead of stopping him, it's like a procedural issue to them. Do you have permission to do that? What they're most concerned about is if he has precedent or authority, because up until this time, they've been the ones who have been making decisions about the temple. They're the ones who had allowed these people in to make a profit in God's holy place. So they issue the challenge of a sign. When God would send prophets, he would send them with a sign, or he would send them with a miracle that they would perform to prove, this is the supernatural thing that I can do that shows that I have divine authority behind what I have to say. So they ask him this. They see Jesus and ignore his desire for pure worship and reframe the incident as a power struggle. So Jesus declines the invitation. We know Jesus is capable of producing a sign. He's performed miracles. In the previous chapter, at the wedding of Cana, he turns water into wine. He's done miracles in public before, but in this case, he declines. And the reason Jesus does this is because he recognizes that the religious leaders were more interested in discrediting him than in justice or protecting the sanctity of the temple. Even a profound miracle would have been insufficient. We see in the Gospels at one point, Jesus is healing people all over the place, and the religious leaders accuse him of doing this under the power of demons. That even when Jesus did show signs, they used it as a way to discredit him and keep power for themselves. So Jesus meets their challenge of a sign with the challenge of a sign. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. John clues us in that Jesus was talking about his body here, not the physical temple. Essentially saying, kill me and I'll be back. That'll be the sign that you'll have. Then you'll know that I have authority. But they don't understand. They were very concrete thinkers. You can't tear down the temple. It took us 46 years to build this temple, and we were just fixing it up. You can't build it in 3 days. It's ironic that this claim was later used by the religious leaders against him at his trial, in which they claimed that he said he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. They were essentially calling him out as a terrorist, saying he claimed that he's going to destroy our most sacred, holy building that we have in all our religion. In actuality, it turned out that they were the terrorists who ended up destroying God's temple because God no longer lived in the temple building. He'd been absent for years, but became present in Jesus. So Jesus responds with this parable of, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And Jesus has a pattern of doing this. He'll use parables, parabolic language, which was clear to those who sought after pure worship, but not to those who sought rules, authority, power, and precedent. The religious leaders heard Jesus' words and took them as a challenge to their authority and the religious paradigm that they were comfortable with. But it says the disciples remembered what Jesus said after he was raised from the dead and believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. When his disciples heard him, they understood and believed because they were focused on pure worship. In these verses, John highlights the two types of people who hear Jesus and how they respond to him. And this is something that he continually does throughout his book. That there's two types of people who hear Jesus and they respond in two different ways. And what it breaks down to is that our approach to Jesus determines whether or not we will understand and learn the truth. So this is what our call to faith is today. How do you approach Jesus? Are you seeking after pure worship? Do you have that zeal that Jesus had? If you read the Bible with the approach, what does this mean for me within my comfort zone? Or how is this compatible with my lifestyle? Then I would challenge that you're not seeking after pure worship. Or how does this portray me in a positive light? Or which part of this confirms my political or philosophical beliefs? Or how does this prove that I'm right? Then I would challenge that you're not seeking after pure worship, but seeking to use it as a weapon. Another way of wording this is, if your approach to the Bible is most concerned with how it benefits you, you're not seeking after pure worship. If you're seeking after pure worship, if your deepest desire is to connect with God and follow him, then the Bible should challenge your current way of life. It's full of lessons that I don't think I can accept at times. It tells us we're to love our enemies, pray for those who persecute us, and that we are to care for all people. All people. We're told to give up our families, and to forfeit our possessions if we must in order to follow him. To follow God, we're told to deny our own self-interest. These are hard things to do, and the task of those seeking after pure worship. In the story of the cleansing in the temple, we see the difference in the response to Jesus' words. And I'd like to give a modernish example in two stories. So I'm going to tell you two stories and contrast them. And what I'm comparing here is the response that happens afterwards, not the reaction. They're very similar in the first part, but with two different responses. The first story is of my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. He lived in Pennsylvania in the late 1700s. Among the settlers there, he was highly esteemed and respected. He was so unfortunate as to be compelled to kill a fellow being to save himself and family from being burned to death. The region along the river was infested by a band of robbers. McLean was the owner of a very valuable stallion which they resolved to take. Having been notified of their intention, he stabled his horse in the kitchen of his house. You know, where you would hide a horse if you had to do it. Like, did it have windows? Like, I feel like most kitchens have windows. Horse would be pretty easy to spot through it. But maybe they had blinds, who knows? When they arrived, they soon discovered the whereabouts of the horse, no blinds, and commanded McLean to bring him out. Receiving no reply, they warned him that unless he did as they bade him, his house would be set on fire. Still receiving no answer, the gang leader commanded some of his men to get straw, and he would show him whether his commands were to be disregarded. Seizing the straw and advancing to execute his threat, McLean fired, killing him instantly. He was then carried off by some of the gang, who wrapped his body in a bed coverlet with stones and sunk it in the river. As a teen, this story excited me. Someone I was related to was threatened by a gang leader and killed the leader in one shot. That was the coolest story for me. I could say, look what someone who's related to me did. For a number of years, this is where I stopped with the story, until I was in college. It was a story that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and I would tell other people. But at one point, I was rereading it, and this time I read the whole way through, all the way to the end of the story. Mr. McLean, in the later years of his life, was greatly troubled in mind by the recollection of this justifiable homicide. There was a man that he would frequently visit, and he was often heard expressing his deep regret for having killed this desperado. So when I finally understood this story, it really got to me. Growing up, I was always someone who relished being able to justify my violence, as you heard in the car ride stories. I was the one punching people. This story seemed to me to be the most justifiable violence I'd ever read, yet he had deep regret for having killed the man. He believed so deeply in the value of all human life that even though he believed that he had done the only right thing, he was torn up by it. His response was grief. Contrast this with this story that came out of Texas a couple weeks ago. A man came into a church in Texas and shot 2 congregants before being shot down by church members. What strikes me most about this story, and what contrasts with the previous story, is the response of the person. The person who shot the shooter commented afterwards, "I don't feel like I killed a human. I killed an evil, and that's how I'm coping with this situation." I'm not saying either reaction was right or wrong. I'm not judging the reaction. I'm questioning the response. I have respect for my great-grandfather that he did what had to be done, but that he also recognized the value of all human life. And I wouldn't claim to know what the appropriate response in that church in Texas was, because I wasn't there, and I don't think it's fair to judge someone's reaction in a life-and-death situation if you weren't present. It's not a judgment on either party, but I want my response to be like my grandfather, who understood and respected all human life. When Jesus was at the temple, he was furious that those there weren't concerned with pure worship. They were using the temple as a means for personal gain. Those of us who claim to have Christ inside us, we are the temple. God isn't present in our lives through a building anymore, but in our bodies. God dwells with us, and he looks for us to have the same zeal that Jesus did. So in your responses to life, as you seek to follow God, are you looking for what you're allowed to do? What authority you have behind your actions? Or is your zeal for pure worship and following God no matter the cost?